Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about asynchronous JavaScript. So we're going to be discussing things like the built-in JavaScript fetch function, as well as promise objects and keywords like async and await. And just to orient you a bit, the idea here is that oftentimes when we write some code, especially when we're writing JavaScript code that's running in a browser, there are things that we need to do which take some amount of time. We're doing a lot of network-related things. We're going over a network, we're retrieving data over a network, we're sending data over a network. These things take time. And while we're waiting, while that's happening, we don't want our users to have to wait. We don't want the rest of our code, the rest of our program to have to wait. We should be able to continue on. Folks should still be able to click on buttons. We should still be able to see images in the interface. We don't want there to be any kind of a lag or a feel of it being hung up. We don't want our code to get hung, right? Even if it's for a second or two, it makes a really big difference in our user experience. We want to be able to say, look, while I'm doing this thing that's taking time, we should be able to do other things, right? And then when that thing is done, I'll deal with it then, right? We'll find out what comes back. We'll deal with the data. And maybe it's an error. We'll deal with that too, whatever it is. But while it's happening, we can kind of put it on the back burner, so to speak. So we're going to talk about how to do that here in JavaScript today. Let me orient you quickly to what we're seeing on the screen here. This is all stuff that we've already talked about in the past. We just have a basic setup. Here is our HTML page that we're seeing using the VS Code internal server. Down here below is our console from our developer tools. We have our basic HTML file up top here. Down below, we have our connected JavaScript file. Inside of the JavaScript file, you'll see that we have our pretty standard starting code where we're adding an event listener to our window and saying when the DOM content is loaded, please go ahead and execute this function, which I'm passing in here. I'm passing in my anonymous arrow function. So after everything is loaded, please go ahead and do this. All right, so just for a little sanity check, let's do this. Let's plug something simple into here. Let's say I want to use a query selector to get the main tag from my page. Here it is right there. I'm going to assign that to a variable and just log it to the console. Sure enough, here you can see there's my main tag. So I've just verified that this is all connected and working correctly. Now, here comes the fun part. We're going to be using a third-party API, a RESTful API, that's just going to return to us data that is actually questions and answers from the game show Jeopardy. We're just using that as some of our test data. So first, what I'm going to have in here, we'll put a couple of things in here. So here's what we have. First, I'm creating my URL. I'm assigning that to my variable that I'm just simply calling URL here. And then I'm calling this function right here, this fetch function. What the fetch function is going to do is it, by default, is going to make a GET request for me to this URL, retrieve the data that comes back, and return what I'm, or at least for now, calling my response. Okay, let's just see if we do a console log of this response and see what happens. So you'll notice when this runs, what I'm getting here over in my console is something called a promise. So that's not the data. That doesn't seem like it's, one of our Jeopardy questions and answers. This is something called a promise. I can open this up a little bit. I can see this is a pending promise. What does it mean that it's pending? At least at the moment when it was returned to me, it was pending. And I can kind of dig around in here and see that there is some response information. But this is meant to be, this really is meant to be something that's intermediary in a sense. It's temporary. The fetch function is asynchronous. What it's doing is it's going out to the world, it's doing something and saying, look, while I'm doing this, you can go ahead and move forward. you can move on. I'm going to promise you, that's where this promise object comes into play. I'm going to promise you that when I'm done doing my thing, I'm going to give you back some data or potentially an error or something. But it's going to take some time. And in the meantime, I'm leaving you behind with this promise. Okay. That is ultimately going to resolve into an actual response. The promise is going to resolve into a response, but it takes time. What immediately comes back from here is that promise object. So what we're going to do here now, what I'm going to change is I'm going to say, all right, listen, instead, I want to wait for this for my code, right? When in the lines of code that I'm writing just here, and you'll see how this works in a second. I don't want this to move on from line 5 to line 6 immediately. I want to wait. So I'm going to say await on this. And you'll see we have an error there. I'm going to address that in a second. What I'm saying here is please await on this fetch call. Don't move on to line 6 yet. Wait for that to finish. Wait for that promise to be fulfilled. Then we can move on. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, aren't you defeating the idea of this being asynchronous? Yes, I am, sort of, temporarily. I'll show you. First of all, let's get rid of this problem. It's saying await expressions are only allowed within async functions. So I need an async function. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, well, this fetch, this was an async function. But what I'm saying now is I'm kind of eliminating that sort of and saying, well, I want to wait on it. But what I can do is say the function that I'm inside of now, I can make that asynchronous. So that means the anonymous function I'm currently inside of up here, right at the beginning of this function, right before my parens, I can say async. Notice as soon as I did that, look what happened. VS Code is thinking, okay, this is now okay. I'm all right with that. There's no more error. And now when I look here, you can see I'm not getting a promise anymore. I'm getting back a response object. And this response object has things inside of it that are like my body. I'm getting okay is equal to true. I'm getting a 200 status, etc. So what's going on here? What I'm saying is I'm allowing this whole function that I'm telling JavaScript the runtime. I'm telling my environment, this function is asynchronous. All right. When this whole function is running, there are going to be times when I need to wait on something. Something is going to be slow. And during that time, during that moment, hey, you can go on and do something else. You can go on and continue processing other stuff. But I'm going to tell you where in my code I need to wait. So you can kind of think of it like that. I'm saying all of this, everything that I'm doing inside of here, taken as a whole, you can look at it as all of this stuff can be done asynchronously, but there's going to be certain spots, sort of the placeholders where I'm saying you can safely put me on a back burner for a minute and do something else. I'm going to show you where those spots in my code are. That's what's happening here, where I'm doing the await, where there's another internal asynchronous function that's happening. At that spot, at that point, I'm saying, all right, look, I got to wait here for a little while, go do something else. I'll let you know when we come back. So that's how this is kind of working here. So now once I've got my response, I need to dig inside of that response, right? I need to make sure that, first of all, I need to make sure everything is okay. So I can do something like this. Let me grab just a little conditional here. Let's come down here and say something like this. We're going to say, now that I've got my response back, I'm going to check that okay property. I'm going to say, if this response was okay, if that's true, everything came back okay, then just for right now, log to the screen what the response is, and that's what I'm seeing. Otherwise, if it didn't come back okay, log an error. I'm just This is what I'm doing just for my test purposes. I can prove this by doing something like this. What if up here I say, well, let me change this to an invalid URL. And you can see here, it's telling me on line 5, right here where the fetch happened, there's an error. It's telling me the 404. And here's my error logged to the console. I got an error in the response. Okay. So now that we're doing this, now that we're doing that little bit of a check, doing a little bit of the validation, what we need to now do is actually get the information out of the response. But here's the deal. That actually takes a little bit of time too. So here's what we're going to do. Let's do something like this. Inside of here, now that we've determined that everything is okay, let's make ourselves, let's make ourselves another variable. We're just going to call this data. And inside of here, we're going to say, all right, we'll take that response, and I want to call function JSON on this. This means go inside of that response, and there's some data in there. It's going to be JSON data. I want you to read it and bring it back into JavaScript and turn it into a nice JavaScript object for me. But this is another thing that is actually asynchronous because it takes some amount of time to do that. So you can see when I do that, if I console log this and I say console log this data, and you'll see when I do that, I'm immediately getting back one of those promises again, same as I did before, right? This is saying, listen, this is going to take me some time. So I promise you, when I'm done, I'm going to give you back some kind of a response. But right now, immediately in that moment, I get back a promise. So this is another spot where I can say, okay, look, this is going to be another one of those places where I know this is going to take time. I'm going to await on this. Once I did that, I say, wait here for a moment, wait till it's done. When this is done, now I can move on and go ahead and log the data. And now you're seeing here, I'm actually getting the content of what was sent back to me from this third-party API. So I can see here, there's a question. Seth MacFarlane wrote lyrics to something or other, apparently. And then up here is an answer. The answer is Ted. And then I have some things in here, like for instance, category. I can see what category is this, or the category title is movie songs. Okay, so I can dig around through that object and see what's the data in there that I want to grab. Well, I'm going to grab some of that data out of there and just go ahead and send it to the screen. So let's do something like this. Let me make myself a function, a very simple function that's going to build some HTML that I can send to the screen here. So I have one of these pre-built. I'm just going to put this down here, and I'll show this to you. So this is just a simple function called create clue HTML. I'm going to pass in a category, question, and an answer. And all it's doing here is building a string. This is what we've done before, doing JavaScript string interpolation, putting in my category, question, and answer, just inside of a div with some simple tags, right? So just basic idea, creating just some simple HTML, which we're then going to put into our page. So now that I have that, what I'm going to do is say, well, I need to pull the data that I'm interested in out of this object. So let's do that here, right in this spot here, right? Now that I've awaited on this, I've pulled this out of here, I have the data. I'm going to, and again, just bear with me. I'm going to just put a little bit of a dump in here. I'm just trying to make my life easy. So I'm going into the data and going into that category sub object, grabbing the title, which we were just looking at a moment ago. I'm going to go into the data and get the question, go into the data, get an answer. I'm keeping those. I'm sending them into my create clue HTML function that I just wrote, getting the response. And, you know, just to make sure that this is working correctly, let's console log this HTML that I'm getting back here. And you can see there, that looks pretty good. This one happens to be the songs of Brian Wilson. All right, that's interesting. That'll be a fun question and answer to look at in a moment. Now that I have that, let's go ahead and stick it into our HTML page. If you remember way at the top here, one of the first things we did was select our main tag. Well, let's just put it inside of there. Rather than console logging, let's say main tag dot inner HTML. And we're going to set that to that HTML that I just cooked. And there we go. Category US cities. Here's our question and our answer. And if I refresh my browser, you can see I'm going to get a nice random different question and answer each time from this third-party API. So again, just to recap, the important part here, let me bring this up a little bit and do a little condensing just to make this a little easier to read. The important stuff is that everything I'm doing here, first of all, is inside of my anonymous function that is getting passed to the event listener for the DOM content loaded, right? Inside of here, I know there's going to be a couple of spots where I'm asking my JavaScript to do stuff that's going to take time. That's right here at fetch and right here at the .json method. These two things, we can look in the documentation on the MDN network and we can see these are asynchronous and they're going to take some amount of time. So what I'm doing when I utilize them is I put the await keyword in front of them and I say, okay, I know they're asynchronous, but for my purposes, in the context of my function here, I don't want to continue on to my next line of code until this actually comes back. I'm going to wait here. But by doing that, by putting await here, and remember, it told us before, we have to make the entire function that we're inside of asynchronous. We're making this whole thing async. So we're saying, hey, JavaScript, hey, browser, listen, here's my function. Here's my whole thing that's going to happen. I want you to run this, and we're going to run this line of code and this line of code and this line of code. But I'm going to say, oh, wait, when you get here, this is going to take a second. So go ahead and do something else for a while. Go do what you got to do. And when this comes back, we'll move on. And the browser does that. It says, great, cool, thanks. And it does its thing, and it continues to be interactive, and we can continue to do stuff. And then when this comes back, then we move on. Then we say, okay, now let's check and see, is the response okay? Yes, it is. Move on to the next line, and boom, we hit another one of those spots. At that spot, we say, I need another minute. Go do your thing. When this finally comes back, I now say, okay, now I have my data. I don't have any more of those asynchronous functions at this point. Because I don't have any more of those, I'm just going to continue on, and my code is going to continue to execute line by line until we're done exiting our function at that point. Okay, so I hope that helps everybody to understand the idea of the basics, at least, of using asynchronous JavaScript. The idea behind the fetch function, using the JSON method, our promises, and await, and async. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time. And thanks very much for your attention.